Hello.
Hello.
We're in the basement of the Lighthouse Cinema in Dublin, which is very exciting.
Very exciting.
And we're here today to ask a few questions to Maeve Cooke from Access Cinema and Stephen. I don't know your second. McNeice. Yeah. A poet's name. Exactly. That's lovely. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about what Access Cinema do. And so I will ask the first question. So Maeve, tell us about what the history of Access Cinema. How long's it been going?
Oh my goodness, a lot longer than I have, thankfully. Access Cinema was originally set up in 1977 as the Federation of Irish Film Societies.
Okay.
So it sort of came from the scenario where you had a number of quite large film societies that had been established between sort of the 1930 or from the 1930s onwards, and you had quite big film societies in the likes of Tralee and Cork and Dublin. So you had these people who were very cine savvy. They knew a lot about films that were being produced in other parts of the world outside of Ireland, knew about things like French Wave and so on, and wanted to see those films in their own kind of city or town. So that's why those film societies had been set up. But often, while they knew what they wanted to see, they needed help in sourcing those films. So they had lobbied for a while in terms of some sort of umbrella situation organization to help them with that, because they were all ultimately volunteers and were doing or running the film societies on their spare time. And they lobbied to the government and to the Arts Council in Ireland, and then ultimately the Federation of Irish Film Societies was set up in 1977 as this umbrella organisation. But at the time, it was very much, I think there was one part-time person in there.
A small.
It was a small kind of organisation, but it did help in terms of coordination and helping those film societies source content in terms of rights and at the time film prints, and consequently moving with technology and so on. And then over time, what happened was the number of film societies did increase, but also the Arts Council started to give money to the various art centres, mixed programme venues that were being built around Ireland.
Yeah. Is this in the 1980s?
This would have been, yeah, from the 1980s primarily onwards. They started to give money both in terms of capital money for equipment, but also support for those venues to include film as part of their overall artistic program. So as a result of those changes, in 2001, the organisation decided to change its name to Access Cinema because it wasn't just dealing with film societies anymore. And ultimately, since then, I joined in 2006, and at the time there was, I think it was maybe between 20 and 30 sites, some of whom at the time were screening on 35mm, and then there were others that were screening from, had traditionally screened from VHS.
Really?
Yes, and prior to that 16mm, but had never had the fundings or the funding to equip themselves with 35mm. So at that point, they were screening from DVD. Blu-ray didn't exist. And since then, the network, as we call it, has doubled in size. We're now working with over 80 different organisations around the country, from the mixed programme or art centre venues, some independent cinemas where they, for example, Cinemax in Bantry in Cork, they are a full-time cinema that screen commercial content, but then they will work with us to present an art house or a cultural cinema programme once a week at certain times of the year. And then the voluntary sector of the film societies, again ranging from very large, long established film societies like Sligo and Galway, all the way down to more recently kind of set up film societies in places like Clifton in County Galway and places in Cork and so on. So that's essentially how it came about.
Well, that's a really good rundown of the kind of sector here as well in terms of the independent sector.
Yeah. What's your role at Access? I mean, you go to a lot of fun film festivals, but you obviously have to do some hard work in between.
Well, if you ask the rest of my team, I do nothing. Sometimes I feel like I do. No. So essentially, yeah, I'm the director of Access Cinema. So ultimately, I guess I drive the artistic programming within the organization, also the different initiatives that we support, the different events and initiatives that we provide to the members. So things like our screening days, where we give our programmers the possibility to see different films in advance of them actually programming them. We also do programming meetings where we talk through the various films coming up. And then in terms of strategy, as the director, I'd be responsible for executing the strategy or leading the strategy as defined or as developed by the board, and then ultimately financial kind of activities rest with me as well.
Stephen, what's your role here?
So I'm the special projects officer. So I joined just around 2 years ago now. So I initially started working with Access as part of the Japanese Film Festival, which is the festival we run with the Japanese Embassy in Ireland. And we the annual festival takes place in 8-9 towns and cities across the country now. So that's kind of like, the kind of activities beyond the, the film club side of things. But we also always work in collaborating with the film clubs as much as we can on that festival, and the art centres. And then I was working on the Cinovate project, which was a European production project we did in 2022 into 2023, which was where we were working with partners in Germany, in Slovenia, in Sweden. Am I missing anyone?
The games guys in Belgium.
In Belgium, yeah. So that was a kind of initiative post-pandemic to try and get people back into cinemas through non-traditional means, through such as video game events, VR events, event cinema events, and also it led to the development of a kind of a platform which we call My Cinema, which is a sort of VOD platform, but also a place to highlight all these non-traditional events that were happening in cinema spaces.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Certainly a sort of growth area.
Yeah.
In terms of, I mean, even sort of more of some of the more traditional film societies are engaging with that kind of area as well.
Yeah, and it was quite interesting, particularly in terms of the VR end of things. We did a number of events in a couple of our kind of traditional art centre venues, and to see the diversity of people coming through the door and the age range, and from we had elderly ladies coming in who had never kind of tried out VR before, all the way through to families coming as a group, and at different stages of kind of exposure to VR. But the whole aim of it was to get them into that venue, and many of the people that came in there so for example, we did an event one weekend on a Saturday all day in the Mermaid Arts Centre. And while some of the people were familiar with Mermaid Arts Centre and its activities, some of them had never been in the Arts Centre prior to that. Some of them had been in the Arts Centre for theatre, for music gigs, but weren't aware that the Arts Centre also did a cinema programme. So that kind of was, the aim of it was to raise the profile around that.
It's interesting, to use VR as something that's quite interesting. We do some work ourselves in terms of VR, and the Nerve Centre up in Derry as well, really kind of engaged with it. And it is interesting. I mean, there's no box office in terms of, it isn't an earner in that sense, but it certainly does bring in different audiences. It certainly engages people.
Because you can only have one person in a device at a time, which is, the challenge, but the engagement we got is very positive across the world. Yeah.
And for us as well, I guess one of the main challenges across the network is that traditionally it does tend to be an older cinema audience. So the challenge is always to bring in those new audiences and younger audiences. And VR can definitely be, and gaming and so on, they can be those activities, while there would be some who frown on them and say that's not cinema. But
it
you
does
know,
engage
it
with
is about bringing people into the space sometimes, particularly in art centres where younger people sometimes don't feel comfortable in those spaces. So to even get them through the door.
Would one of Access's roles be to kind of support people in engaging with new work and engaging with new kind of ideas within exhibition and things like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the so in terms of the rest of the staff, we have 5 staff in total. So Karen and Michael are our 2 program advice people, or advisors. Sorry, that's the word. Advisors. I couldn't think of the word there for a moment. But a crucial part of that role is also advising, not just in terms of the program, but also having those continual conversations with the various different sites about their audiences and what might work for their audience in comparison to what they've shown previously. Where, you know, it's easy to program something that you know is going to bring in an audience, or you know your existing audience is going to respond to. But part of our work is always to keep helping those film societies and art centres push the boundaries a little bit more and develop those audiences, so that it's not just their existing audience, that they are constantly reaching out to new audiences. So it's always a two-way conversation about the program, what films will work for their existing audiences, but what other films might work in reaching new audiences, whether they're young people or whether it's new communities. And there are obviously very many new communities.
Yeah, especially in the changing society like
exactly,
Ireland.
Yeah. So that would be a key part of our work, is developing or helping them and supporting them with those with that development. Because again, with film societies, you know, they're doing it on a voluntary basis. They don't necessarily have the time, but also with venues. Many venues these days are very short-staffed, particularly smaller venues where, you know, they might be running on a skeleton staff. So it can be a big ask for them to try and initiate that outreach themselves. And Stephen has worked on a program we've been doing the last 18 months.
Yeah, about 2 years now.
Which is kind of geared towards that.
Yeah, so it's the new audience initiative. So we were kind of having a look at it, kind of broadly similar to the British fan audience initiative.
We hardly recommend.
Yeah. Basically, we pick one film per quarter that we try to really, you know, give an extra push behind, give extra resources behind. And it's kind of, you know, we try to pick a film that won't naturally end up on art centres or film club programs. So everyone's going to show Anatomy of a Fall. So that's not the type of film we want to focus on. We want to focus on, you know, from countries that may be underrepresented in cinemas, or, you know, films that may appeal to audiences that would not be the traditional art house film audience. So like our most recent film is How to Have Sex, for example, because that was, you know, we felt that was a really important film to get out there and to kind of encourage venues to show because of its appeal to young people. And I actually,
it might be a reticence in terms of
exactly. Yeah. And I just actually, I think I read yesterday in the UK, I think it's actually being toured around schools as part of a consent programming. But other films would have been things like We Turn to Dust, which is a Chinese film. Man with a Mandarin language, but that did exceptionally well across the board. And I think it was close to an Access Cinema exclusive because again it didn't get much of a commercial you know, release over here. It might have had a few screenings in the IFI, but beyond that, so that's the kind of thing. And then, you know, as part of that, we try to produce additional resources. So that might be as simple as social media assets that are tailored towards each individual venue that shows it, and kind of, you know, at the upper end, you know, we've done you know, exclusive Q&As with the filmmakers of films. One of the most popular ones was Love According to Dalva, which is an exceptional film that we gave a big push to last year, and we managed to get the director on board for Q&A that then venues were able to screen.
Makes a big difference to
exactly.
get the buy-in from the film.
And it was just a recording, but we were able to get one of our members on board to actually conduct the Q&A because it was in the French language. So again, it's kind of all feeding into that kind of, you know, dynamic sense of a network as well.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I just want to ask you about what the criteria is for those films. Like, is it a film that is close to theatrical release, or does it not have had to, or can it not have had a theatrical release here, or what way do you play that?
I think it can be something that had got a theatrical release, but it's usually, our most basic criteria is that it's a film released in a particular quarter. So we have 3 quarters or 4 quarters per year, sorry, that we pick one film from. It's a little bit, there's no specific criteria. We just try to avoid repetition as much as we can. So we try to make the year as diverse and interesting as we can from a content perspective. Documentaries have always been a challenge across the network. Some venues would be quite reluctant to show documentary content, so that would be that would be part of our consideration. So like All the Beauty and the Bloodshed was one of the films for that reason. But again, it's just we just have to keep an eye out and see what the most interesting films of the time are. Yeah,
it's really good for new audience as well. We find that we would run a similar project called the Collective Tours, and we've just finished a tour of Ballywalter.
Yeah.
And the the anecdotal evidence from our members that took the film is they're all new or half, but 50% are new audiences. Just from a simple hand raise in the room. So it's really interesting. That you're doing this yet. We should swap stats sometime.
I was going to ask. I mean, that those kind of projects are sort of post-COVID projects about developing audiences and sort of bringing new people into venues and things like that. How do you feel your members feel now coming back? I never got the impression that any of them were despairing so much, but there was a sense that some may felt that bad times were just around the corner. But maybe a little bit of optimism.
Did you lose any?
We did lose some. We lost a few smaller film societies, and that kind of came down to the fact that people moved. Circumstances changed, all of those sort of things, and particularly if a film society, which we try and dissuade, but if a film society or film club is sort of led by just one person as opposed to a committee, then obviously if their circumstances change and nobody else is willing to take on the film club, naturally will fall away. So I guess COVID sort of expedited that maybe in some instances. What we have seen is that the film clubs, I guess the challenge for them was that, and they have been slower, or they were slower to come back to full activity than, say, the venues, because I guess during COVID, the venues were constantly responding to the changes in terms of the health requirements and everything. Exactly, in terms of
full-time job, just keeping up.
Exactly. Whereas in the situations of many of the film clubs where they weren't actually in control of their setup. So and also there was that kind of thing where, because they're volunteers and they're often in small communities, they didn't want to be responsible if somebody got sick at one of their screenings. So there was a reluctance, and which we completely understand. So, for example, in 2023, we were almost back to, I'd say, 80% of the sites. Maybe even more, actually. There were 1 or 2 film clubs that, actually, there was one film club that really only restarted this year.
Same for us.
But I suppose there was a little bit of sort of fear about, well, will we be able to get our audience back, because it's been such a, kind of long period of time that we've been out, and financially we'll be able to cover our costs. So we've just tried to support them and adapt as well, or as much as possible to help them in that respect. Last year, 23, was a good year in terms of the network. I mean, I had projected that we would be at 75% of audience admissions of 2019, and we actually exceeded that. But that was largely down to 3
specific types.
It was down to primarily the Irish kind of Banshees, Quiet Girl, and actually, sorry, not non-Irish, but big Irish star, Paul Mescal in After Sun.
Of course.
Those 3 films were basically saved many of the sites. So this year is really, I think, for us, the year that we'll really see the actual where things are at. I'm talking to people, there's definitely an optimism. And I think, we during COVID, no more than yourselves, we kept in contact with all of our sites on a regular basis. Every time there was a change, we would either, I mean, I know Karen and Michael were constantly, kind of in contact, on phone calls, Zoom calls, etc., with people, just updating them and checking in where people were. And then we also had group calls as well, Zoom calls, just to let people know. And even if they weren't going to be programming a particular period, we just felt it was important that we kept them updated on what was happening within the Irish sector as a whole, but then obviously whatever was happening in the UK was having an immediate impact on the Irish cinema landscape. Everything was changing all of the time, as you know. And I think there is definitely an optimism. Some sites have seen an increase.
Yeah, it's only anecdotal, but even speaking to people at our screening day yesterday, several people said to me like they're seeing an uptick, an audience. However small the uptick may be, they're still very optimistic about how things are looking.
Yeah, they realised what they missed.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it did, I mean, when the restrictions were completely lifted, because cinema was allowed with certain restrictions during COVID, it was all the other activity like festivals, music festivals and theatre and going to meet people and so on, that for a while there, cinema was sort of put on the back foot for a little while. And I think that did cause concern for people. They were like, oh my gosh, not just within our network, but across, I mean, I'm sure you saw it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Barbenheimer is a kind of, as a concept and an event and a moment in time, I think was for me a bit of a watershed in terms of people going back and the cinema being a really high priority in terms of people's entertainment life or kind of social life.
We have to give a shout out to Kenneth Branagh in Belfast. Huge around the streets after.
Up north, I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure, but
yeah, he certainly.
There's the same with The Quiet Girl here.
Yeah,
that completely shook the
cobwebs
expectations.
I went to see that in East Belfast and Dundonald of all places, and it was a packed cinema. I don't think I would have predicted that 10 years ago, but there is. I mean, they're constantly shifting, and the way that people find out about films is constantly shifting.
And that is a challenge. Because things change during COVID, but now we're having those funny conversations where the physical brochure we thought was gone, but it's not, it's back. While things have moved on, the more they change, the more they stay the same sometimes. But there have been a lot of very positive kind of developments from COVID, and I do think that there's a general optimism. And we've seen quite a number of new members in the last 18 months, or people getting in contact, wanting to set up a film club.
We find that as well, in terms of there is still a kind of appetite for that, and film is a relatively cheap way of engaging audiences as well. So
even as in 2024 so far, we've had innumerable calls of people looking to set up clubs, and they won't all they won't all work out or whatever.
No.
There's definitely an enthusiasm there that feels almost like there's a general atmosphere out there. I think that people are a little bit more excited about film.
I think it's also about the community though as well, and because we did see that as well after the recession, we saw a real sort of uphill increase in terms of, because people wanted to stay local, and I think as well COVID has sort of tapped into that that community shared sort of experience and the connections that people have in their local communities, and appreciating that more, then that means that they want to initiate new things in their communities.
What's the sort of makeup of your membership in terms of rural and urban areas?
Oh gosh, what do you define as urban in Ireland?
Outside Dublin. We always say like outside Belfast.
So do we.
Oh, and Derry. Yes, sorry, Derry.
Because that's always, I mean, one of the sort of the interesting conversations that we're always having is with UK distributors around releases and their expectations for numbers in Ireland, and you have to remind them that in the south of Ireland there is only one city over 1 million people, and then the next one down is barely 500,000, and to them that's a town in the UK, in mainland UK. So
different landscape.
But I mean, ultimately it's primarily regional. I'd say 80% 80 to 90% are regional locations. And some counties are more numerous in terms of their activity. Cork is particularly
Interesting.
yes. There's a lot of between art centres and film clubs and so on. That there's there's a lot of activity in Cork. For some reason, we have film clubs in places as remote as
Somewhere in Wicklow or.
well, we have there's an art centre in the courthouse in Tinnahealy, which runs a film programme. It's not every week, but by the same token, again, you look at a map in Ireland and you think, oh, that's very close. But if you look at somewhere like Inverin in Galway or Clifton in Galway, even though on the map they look very close, on a wet, windy night to get into your car and think about driving.
Bad
So
roads.
they're bad roads. We've places like Kenmare. Kenmare would be,
In terms of festivals and things like that, will people drive down to Galway or
In terms of our members, I mean, we try and do networking events at each festival now. The last number of years, we've done a programming meeting at Cork. It does depend on kind of the dates and so on, but I guess we do find that in traveling to festivals, it does tend to be the volunteers that will, maybe have that flexibility. Often staff in the art centres, again, could be working on weekends, or again, if they're very short-staffed in that they just won't have the time to dedicate to that. But we try and encourage as much as we can by having those networking events and also offering tickets to the members that we will, kind of to various screenings in the festival that we'll subsidise for them.
You mentioned distributors there.
Yes.
Just want to maybe talk through your relationship with the distributors, because that's key to making all of this stuff work, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, essentially, we work with all of the Irish distributors, even all the way up to the big studios. But on a day-to-day basis, it would be the likes of Volta and Eclipse and Breakout.
Volta's the new name for
Elements, yes,
right?
yeah.
For older listeners.
And then because I guess the core programs for most of our members do tend to be international, Irish and independent cinema as opposed to commercial cinema. We work with all of the distributors in the UK. Essentially, our service revolves around the idea that we're sort of the connecting point between the various programmers and venues and the distributors. So rather than each programmer having to figure out, what distributor has the rights for this film and how to contact them and so on, we will basically take all of the bookings for a particular film. We will contact that distributor and we'll submit the bookings on behalf of all of those sites. And then we look after coordinating the delivery of the film materials, whether that be a DCP or whether, in the case of a non-DCP site, whether that's a disc or more increasingly an actual digital file. And we will coordinate delivery to the sites. And then afterwards, the sites will return their box office information to us. We coordinate and send that all to the distributors and they invoice us. And then we will send an invoice with all of to each site, so that again they're not getting lots and lots of invoices, depending on how often they screen. Obviously,
You're getting a lot of admin.
We're getting a lot of admin.
You have to.
So
spreadsheets.
we say that we take the pain out of it for both sides, and we absorb all the pain ourselves. And I guess with the UK distributors in particular, the guys will be dealing with them on a daily basis for them to figure out how to get a film to, I don't know, where is that now? So that really, kind of, that they really value the fact that they can just hand that over and they don't have to worry about it. Across the board with the UK and Irish distributors, we really value the relationships we have with them, because part of that as well is also negotiating the film hire fees around that and trying to get the best deal, I guess, for our members. Ultimately, I think, given the fact that, as you referred to earlier, outside of Dublin, the only other full-time art house cinema in Ireland is Palace in Galway. Sorry, in the south of Ireland, QFT. And and then beyond that, you do have Triskel and Cork, but they're not a full-time
Mhm.
venue. So really, when it comes to, beyond the initial release of a film, our network is key
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah.
And that's sort of reflected as well in terms of how early we can get the films.
Yeah.
So with certain distributors, we'll be able to get something like, say, Perfect Days now, Mubi, their title. We should be able to get that 4 to 5 weeks after release for
Yeah.
one day
Yeah.
booking for a DCP site, and then there might be a little bit further for a non-DCP site, but again, dependent on the film, and that's kind of part of the conversations. That's why we're constantly having those conversations, is that we're responding, and also the distributors responding to how the film is doing. So we try to encourage them to provide the film as early as possible to our site, so that it's for their benefit in terms that they're kind of potentially more revenue in terms of if more audiences come for those films, and for the site, if they can get the film earlier, they're able to kind of benefit from all of the profile around a particular film at a particular time.
It's quite interesting, when we first started working together, you invited us down to some very interesting kind of presentations around the rollout of DCP across the arts centres and with the Arts Council and things like that. And it was quite interesting for us to see how much, in European terms, Ireland's audiences are very high for cinema. I think the highest, really, in per head of the population and per screen and things like that. Why do you think that is? I mean, we're not traditionally a powerhouse or centre of film. The island isn't somewhere where you could. It's not like Italy or kind of places that had a huge heritage in the 50s and 60s.
If you went back to the 50s and the 40s, and there was a cinema in every small town. Key to it is language. I think English language is so therefore, in kind of the first half into the second half of the 20th century, you did have people, and obviously this is before television, that was often in a small town. That might have been the big event to do, and you were getting the films at the time, I guess, the UK films and the American films. So there was a tradition there of exhibition. But that, I guess, that's the challenge in terms of both your role and our role, is that we're trying to expand beyond the English language and or the commercial content. But that tradition of going to the cinema, while it has, been challenged by TV and then video and so on, it has never really sort of gone away. And you're right. Ireland is, I think, definitely before COVID, if it wasn't the top, it was the second highest, per something like 3.9 or 4 times per year per person.
Right across the island as well. It's the same in the north as well, really high.
The north seems to be the place where there's been the best return in terms of post-COVID. I think we're almost at 2019 levels now, and like in England it's 75% or something like that. So there is still that. I suppose rural populations, in terms of social life, in terms of people gathering together, ballroom of romance, there are the traditional tropes of Irish life, and
there are community centres there, but also the art centres have been terrific in terms of having such a network where for now 30 years there's been a embedded kind of international film program, and audiences are still coming out for them.
It's interesting. Well, if you build it, they will come and all that.
Well, yes, and hopefully they'll come some more. And more of them.
Well, Maeve, Stephen, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam.
Really great to get a kind of rundown and a detailed kind of insight into the sector down south. So thank you very much.
Thank you.